At the time, around 1970, about 90% of the capital in international exchanges was related to the real economy, meaning it was either for investment or manufacturing or trade, something like that, and about 10% was speculative. By 1990, those figures had reversed. About 90% was speculative. The latest report I've seen from the UN, 1994, was about 95% speculative, 5% real economy related. Furthermore, the scale has just exploded. There's now about $1 trillion a day or so moving around on international exchanges. This speculative capital drives down growth rates. It makes it very difficult for a government to carry out stimulative economic policies of any kind, because if it does, the capital's going to move somewhere else because they don't want growth. That's why you get headlines in the papers now saying, Wall Street fears economic growth or something, or economic growth feared, we have to reduce it. Economic growth is now considered an evil which has to be beaten down, and there's a huge amount of capital around. It overwhelms governments, even rich ones like ours. And that was already understood by the economics profession in the late 70s. A combination of protectionism and state subsidy in the rich countries and imposing free market conditions on the poor countries, that double-edged policy, which is the standard one, goes back to the 18th century. That's what free markets really are. Nobody accepts free markets for themselves. You always ram them down someone else's throats. But that division, those dual policies have sharpened the division between the poor and the rich quite substantially in the last years. So if you take the rich countries and the poor countries, say the top 20% and the bottom 20%, the gap between them approximately doubled from 1960 to 1990 as a combination of the much higher protectionism in the rich countries and the imposition of free market policies in the poor countries. That's how they separated in the first place. The first world and the third world were pretty similar in the 18th century. But the rich countries like us and England and so on followed highly protectionist policies, and the poor countries were forced into market policies, which led a major factor that led to the difference. Since 1960, that escalated, but even more strikingly, if you take the richest 20% of the population across the countries and the poorest 20% across the countries, the gap there increased much more sharply. Got to about 60 to 1 between the countries, about 140 to 1 in the populations, which means that internally to the various countries, including by now us, the richest country, the gap between the rich and the poor is spreading very fast. What that's doing is internationalizing the third world model, with the United States in the lead, because we're the most powerful country, so we sort of lead the way. The inequality in the United States is the greatest in the industrial world. This is the richest country in the world with by far unparalleled advantages, so the complete catastrophic failure of the economic system is dramatically obvious here. The poverty level is about twice that of any other country. Wages have now dropped to lower than any other industrial country, with the exception of England, which has done even a better job under Thatcher of smashing down its own working people. This was called in the Wall Street Journal a welcome development of transcendent importance when they noticed it a couple of years ago, showing how wages had dropped relative to other countries since 1985, through this combination of highly protectionist policies for the rich and essentially market principles, so free market principles for the poor. Poor means the large majority of the population in the country and in the world. Well, those policies are now being accelerated. That's essentially what the Republican Congress is about. So they call themselves, there's a lot of talk about the free market, but if you look, it's the traditional double-edged free market. So cut down, school lunches, but increase subsidies to the rich. That's the way it's working across the board. It becomes very dramatic if you look at it close. It works in precise detail. Sometimes it's even pretty dramatic. So, for example, during the debate over school lunches, you remember a couple of weeks ago, Representative David Obey submitted a kind of a harassment amendment. He didn't really expect it to pass, and it didn't. He proposed that they keep $7 billion in school lunches and pay for it by delaying the deployment of the F-22 stealth fighter, not stopping the deployment, but just delaying it for a couple of years. That would have paid the $7 billion for school lunches. Well, of course, that never even got to a vote. It was so ridiculous. The F-22 fighter is a $72 billion welfare program, which goes primarily to Newt Gingrich's constituents. The Lockheed Corporation is now Lockheed Martin, merged, two big military systems. Its headquarters is Cobb County, Georgia, his district. His district happens to get more federal subsidies than any suburban district in the country, with the exception of Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington, actually. It's where the Pentagon is and so on. And Brevard County, Florida, which is where the Kennedy Space Center is, another part of the system of welfare for the rich. So if you move out of the federal system itself, Gingrich is sitting in the place which gets more welfare than any place in the country. So it's really easy when you've got the nanny state pouring money into your pocket to be a conservative and denounce the nanny state and let's have tough love for everybody else and so on and so forth, as long as there's no tough love for us rich folk. And this goes right across the board. The Heritage Foundation, which is the ultra-right foundation, just came out with its budget proposals, which has cut down everything that could possibly help any person, but increase the military budget. Not because we're under threat. The idea that the U.S. is under threat is too ludicrous to discuss. But because rich people are under threat. The threat is that the corporate profits, which have shot through the roof, might not shoot through another roof. That's the threat. So while real wages have been declining, from about 1980, there's been a steady decline of median real wages and an increase in working hours right through the Clinton recovery, incidentally. Corporate profits are absolutely booming. In 1993, Fortune magazine, every year at the end of the year, they run a thing on the Fortune 500, the big 500 rich corporations, and they described it, they just couldn't contain themselves. It was a dazzling year for profits. Even though sales growth, they said, was stagnating, but profits were going way up. Well, that was 1993. The figures have just come out for 1994. It was much, much better. Business Week and Fortune and the other journals are, they're saying business has a problem. It has so much money coming out of its coffers that it doesn't know what to do with it. The last quarter of 1964 broke all records and will probably go up again. And remember that that's not any longer the sole source of huge capital concentration, because that's now shifted to a large extent to financial capital, places like Goldman Sachs and the people who are Bill Clinton's cabinet. That's another big concentration of capital, the function of which is mostly to drive down growth and increase inequality.